Welcome in this new video of 5x6 chess where I learn you basics of the middle game and the endgame, so keep on watching. And here my opponent opens with the move b3, making room for the bishop to fianchetto, and I do the same. Fianchetto is often a nice way to develop your pieces. Here my opponent immediately counters the center, right? So you want to have a pawn in the center, develop your pieces, and that's not what my opponent is doing, but there was not a lot of options besides fianchettoing, and this is also a fine option. Here I could go for the fianchetto as well, but then I thought, well, maybe this and later c4 looks good for my opponent. So I went for this approach right away, attacking this pawn and maybe trying to make use of this pin over here. And if white were to make a useless move, for example something like this, then already I have this move. And you cannot take back like this, right? Do you see why? Yes, of course, because then the rook hangs because of this pin and maybe even more later on. And also because of a different reason, because you cannot take back with the queen as well. Why? Let's see, let's take, and then the bishop comes out, taking away all these squares. It's protected, right? So you cannot take it. It has to go back. And do you see the winning move here? Yes, knight here basically attacks the queen, and the queen doesn't have any escape squares, and the queen is lost. So instead of a useless move, my opponent decides to take this pawn right away. And now if I were to take here, then taking back doesn't work, because already you can go here. Maybe this even works, right? So if you go here, then you can even take the queen with a check and the pieces are equal, and white is even a pawn up after the move a3. So instead I decide to take back the pawn. Now the question for white is, how are you going to develop? Well, this would be a very straightforward move, putting your bishop on the diagonal, but then likely I would push my pawn and the bishop has to retreat. So you need to make room for your pieces to develop, and the move d3 is a very good move, and now your pieces can develop to these squares. And I try to do the same, also trying to get a hold on this square, and maybe the knight will land there. At least I'm making room for my knight to land there, and maybe the bishop can go here as well, and there too. Now my opponent makes this great move and trying to put the knight on either c4 or e4. And if it would land on e4, then I could simply take it right away. But this is also a big threat. And the question is how to continue. I could go here, but then likely black will get access to the c-file. And for me it's a bit difficult to get my rook into the game, so that's not what I wanted. And if I would go here, then likely the knight will end up here. So instead I went for this move, eyeing on the c3 square, which would be a juicy square. But the question is, where's this knight now going? And I was thinking that it would go here, because after this move I can go here with my queen and the knight will land here and everything looks fine for me. Maybe at some point I will trade off the knight and the game goes on. But my opponent had a great move and went here with the knight, taking care and getting rid of my escape square and attacking the queen as well. But is there a good move here for me? Am I losing the queen or not? Do you see it? Yes, you can move the knight here, attacking the queen. So if my opponent will take here, I can at least take his queen. Does it work? I will show it. But first, let's see if my opponent takes the knight. Well, then I will simply take back. And this looks quite fine for me with the connect 3 and the bishop to develop here. And all good for me. And if the queen were to go here, then I simply take the knight, and with an extra pawn to be exact. So this is a great position for me. Instead, my opponent opted for the most obvious kind of moves. He took my queen, now I can take his queen, and here my opponent could go back. But then I will also simply go back, and this looks quite dryish. Instead, my opponent decided to take the knight, and I took the knight as well. With some pressure on this pawn, right? Because of this pin. So my opponent needs to act right away, and my opponent maybe could have gone here, but then I think this is a good move. After takes, I do get some pressure here. Maybe the king has to go back right away. Instead, my opponent decided to take. I could take back with the bishop and with the rook. If I take back like this, the king has to come forward. But it's very hard for me to get any pressure on this pawn because the bishop now blocks the file of the rook, so I decided to take back with the rook. Still having this pin on the board and maybe get my bishop here to put some pressure on this pawn. My opponent brings in the king, right? It was the only piece which was not doing anything. This bishop is still on its starting square, but is also protecting. So it is also doing something. And here I play my bishop here, preventing the king from going in and attacking both the rook and the pawn, and also attacking this pawn. This could be an option, but then I have a check and the king would go here. And there's not really a way in for me. And this looks like a complete draw. Instead, my opponent decided to defend the pawn and look at these pieces all on the first row. But this pawn is now defended twice, so I cannot take it. So how am I going to break through? Well, first let's bring in the king. The king was not active yet, so in the endgame it's important to have an active king, because in the end it's also an attacking piece, right? But how to continue as white? Because your pieces are quite weak, and I think my opponent here went for the right option, and it's simply to challenge my position. If I were to take, then you take back, and with opposite colored bishops, this is a draw. But at the same time I was thinking, okay, these bishops are of opposite colors, and these pawns are also on the squares of the color of my bishop, so I would love to attack them. So that's why I put my bishop over here, trying to get in from behind. My opponent takes with the check, I take it back with my king, bringing in the king, also defending the rook, and maybe walking over here to attack the e-pawn at some point. My opponent went for the trade of rooks, I take it with my bishop, it will likely also go here at some point, and I want to make sure that my king still has the option of going to the e-pawn. My opponent brings the king forward, very strong, getting the opposition, preventing me from going forward in any case, so I cannot make any progress here with my king, but I can target the loose pawns. And that's very important in an opposite colored bishop. Ideally, you want to have your pawns on the opposite color than your opponent's bishop, because then they can be targeted. In this case, my bishop has the same color as my opponent's pawns, so I can target them. And another important thing to be aware of is that you cannot win with just this pawn with the opposite color than the promotion square, because then the king can always hide over here, and this will be a draw. So this looks very drawish, and my opponent advances the e-pawn. If I were to take, I have my pawns on the wrong square, so ideally I want my opponent to take. So that's why I play my bishop here, going after this pawn. My opponent brings in the king, very good move. He also could have taken, and then I would have taken back, but still then this saves the day, basically. Here I simply take the pawn, my opponent takes the pawn, and this is completely drawish, and I decide to take this pawn, and this is a draw. But I think there are some very important and key middle game and endgame principles to learn from this game, so please use them yourself, and don't forget to like, subscribe. See you soon, bye bye!